I don't usually go on rants in my videos. I often view them as immature in nature, and people tend to lose themselves in the process. In fact, just by looking it up, it turns out the word rant stems from the Dutch term ranten, which means to talk nonsense. Yet, in times like this, I just can't help but express my resentment, especially when a topic like this reveals so much about us as a species. So, let's talk some nonsense. So Disney and Pixar's latest film, Elio, just released onto digital, Blu-ray, and Disney Plus this past month, after having suffered a disastrous theatrical run. What's that? This is the first time you ever heard of this film? Is that true, or did you hear that from a popular influencer you like? No, seriously, ever since the film was released in theaters, I kept reading statements saying, "Oh, Disney didn't promote this film," or "Oh, this is the first time I've ever heard of it." Ah yes, common statements made by people who refuse to admit that they're part of a bigger issue. And I just had to ask, how could you not hear about this film? I mean, it's not like the movie didn't get any, trailers, ad spots on YouTube and the Disney Channel, a few posters at the cinema, posts on Instagram and other platforms. Oh look, interviews with some of the cast members, like they did with Lilo and Stitch. Oh, and Happy Meal tie-ins. Oh, but of course, those don't count. You know, just because you didn't see any advertising doesn't mean it was non-existent. Well, what did you expect? Plushies, popcorn buckets? I doubt Pixar needed to post on Reddit of all places to get your attention. I doubt Disney needed to build a giant effing spaceship to tell you that this film was coming out. Heck, they got recognition from the US freaking military, or so it seems. And yet some of these posers just pass it off as desperation and propaganda. But fine, the movie didn't get any promotion. It sure as hell doesn't sound like you're all just parodying one another. But hey, you know how the rumor mill goes. The more a story is repeated without viable proof, the more likely it is to become actual fact. Maybe because you were all too busy complaining about the sequels and remakes, that you just so happened to let this film fall under the radar. Oh, I see. Now, this is going to sound a little insane, but I bet these people are ignoring original films like this in theaters because it would wreck their narrative that Hollywood is out of ideas and Disney is just a content mill pumping out sequels and remakes constantly. You know, that part doesn't sound too far-fetched if you think about it. This whole discourse did start with Disney way back in the late 2010s, when most of their film slate consisted of sequels and remakes, and highly successful ones, regardless of quality. These events, along with a lot of bad press that the company has accumulated over the years, led to many people online catching what I like to call Disney derangement syndrome. And now they're unable to critique the company properly without getting angry with nostalgia of the good old days. Now, I'm not going to deny that there aren't any cracks within the House of Mouse, but because the company is everywhere you look, it's made them an easy target for criticism whenever things go south. Fast forward to today, and nothing really has changed, or so to speak. Not only are people saying the film had no advertising, but they're also claiming that Disney preemptively sabotaged Elio's release in order to boost their sequels and remakes. Even Saberspark of all people has fallen under this delusion. He may have recovered from those grooming allegations, but he has a long way to go to look past Disney's current sequel phase. But good on him and other YouTube critics for at least giving this film a chance. Which I can't say much for other people on the platform, because it turns out this film wasn't good enough for them. So let me get this straight. Being an original movie isn't enough to satisfy you? Your movie has to be good? Well, that's something I didn't think I'd hear from these people. It's almost as if, instead of asking for something original, this whole time, we should have been asking for something good! Something of quality! Something that's actually worthwhile! Most of all you are out there whining that there's not enough original films. But an original film finally comes out in theaters and you're all like, oh no, we actually want something that's good for once. Well, boo-hoo. Maybe, just maybe, you all should have been driving that lane in the first place. Now what's your excuse?
But hey, all films are subjective, right? Actually, no, not really. What I mean to say is, we all have different standards for what a good film should be.
Me, I can honestly care less about a film being original in any sense. However, I will critique originality just to stick it to the pigs who pretend to advocate for originality. Because quite frankly, movies often recycle familiar plot lines, familiar character archetypes, familiar tropes, and familiar overlying themes. Therefore, I care more so about the film being good and whether these qualities benefit the film or not. And sometimes I'll discuss other aspects like lighting, cinematography, and of course pacing.
However, I'm going to let you all in on a little sad truth that I eventually had to come to terms with. That being, not every person watches movies to become the next Spielberg or Tolkien. What I mean to say is, they're not always in it for the story and characters. They just want to sit back, relax, hang with friends, watch their favorite actors on screen, gaze at the cool visuals, or the thing I dread the most, escapism. Because why think about story and characters when you could just turn off your brain for 2 hours?
People online really want to sell you on the idea that only bad films bomb at the box office, and yet they neglect to remember that this year's Minecraft and Jurassic World movies were a thing. But what are people saying about this film that is making them so upset?
Okay, so they're saying the film is quote-unquote derivative.
Now, I don't know any of you personally, but I highly doubt the film bombed because it was derivative. On the contrary, moviegoers outside the web space are actually quite cool with derivative films. Take Avatar for example. Or if you wanted to use today's standards, the latest brain-dead action flick featuring Jason Statham. I'm not saying these films are great. There's just other factors to consider, which I'll discuss real soon.
Then there's this whole fiasco, if you could call it that, surrounding the art style, which in my opinion has to be the least offensive thing about this movie. It's another issue that dates back to the late 2010s. But instead of wasting my time on it, I'm just going to sum up by saying, action shows aren't forever, and blame Cartoon Network for your insecurities, and not Disney. If these people really cared, they would have actually gone into depth about the film's flaws. But no, this guy just says the art style is unappealing, then proceeds to talk about video games that nobody's heard of. This guy just scrolls through random tweets trashing the art style, as if they actually mattered. But once again, we see that same repeating pattern as with the no promotion claims. It sounds less like legit problems with the movie, and more like online users are generating outrage to put Disney in a negative light. In other words, it sounds more to me like a you problem than a problem with the film as a whole. And with the rest, you have the anti-woke grifters. Now, not all of them are this way, but just by looking at the thumbnails of their videos, and because they have similar talking points, they most likely harbor that audience. But if you're tired of hearing me bash other people's opinions, you're probably wondering, what are my thoughts on this film? Well, since I am the only one in the country who's ever heard of it, I guess it makes sense for me to give my own 2 cents about it. So, here is a short review of Pixar's latest offering. Okay, for those of you who just learned of its existence yesterday, allow me to spoon-feed you the premise. It's about a kid wanting to find a sense of belonging after his parents died. Then one day, after witnessing a closed planetarium and all its wonders, he makes it his goal to get abducted by aliens, and to escape the world he did not fit in. The film then sadly devolves into your average lie-revealed storyline, where he actually gets his wish, but then he has to pose as Earth's leader in order to stay with his new extraterrestrial friends forever. Along the way, he befriends a life-size larva who doesn't want to follow in the footsteps of his father, a ruthless warmonger who wants to take over the communiverse by force. They become friends, bond over their differences, and that's about as far as I'll go. Okay, I'm going to start off by saying the film's strengths are in its emotional core and themes of loneliness and finding a sense of belonging. Elio genuinely feels like a character who's been through a lot of pain and grief. People might find him annoying, However, this might be the most realistic depiction of a child after having lost its parents, in my opinion. I, for one, am glad they don't give him cliched lines like, "Nobody understands me," or "I'm different." Now, he doesn't go through much change, but he does learn to accept where he belongs in the end. I also appreciate the lighting and composition of some scenes, enhancing the mood and showcasing Pixar's updated technology. And contrary to what you've heard, there are some instances of rule of thirds, but I doubt that aspect always mattered to the grifters. It sounds like they're just tossing around random film jargon when they can't find anything progressive about it to criticize. The film is a bit shoddy in its pacing. Now, while the emotional scenes do hold some weight, some scenes are too quick to leave an impact. Like how Elio explains that his aunt gets on his nerves as a parent, and his worm pal, Glorden, says that his aunt must really care about him. Not really leaving much room for thought there. We don't spend a whole lot of time with Elio's aunt, who does have her own bit of struggles of trying to raise him after his parents' passing. Also, the supposed villain's change of heart felt a bit sudden and unearned, especially after he nearly destroyed the Communiverse. Speaking of which, the only thing memorable about the aliens in the Communiverse is their designs. Personality-wise, they're all just happy-go-lucky most of the time they're on screen, and we don't learn much else. That, and they're not that bright for a community of highly intelligent beings. I mean, they did think he was the leader of his planet, and Elio uses their own technology to outsmart the villain a few times, and it almost works. Pretty odd that they didn't think of that. Actually, seeing aliens that aren't so smart might be the most refreshing aspect of this movie. Now, in terms of the live revealed plot, it almost works in this case. Now, my major gripe with this cliche is that it always ends the same way. That the deceased party feels like they can no longer trust the deceiver, even though the deceiver has some good ideas to help them in some peril. Usually the protagonist is much older, but here Elio is just a child. He comes up with good ideas, but they both backfire, and people can clearly see he's not qualified to rule a planet. And to be fair, he does have a legit reason for lying to the alien committee. So, if you ask me, with the aliens already being pretty below average for intelligent beings, this might be one of the better attempts at this trope I've seen in ages. You know, if it's true what they said, Disney was probably right to not promote this film. Elio might be an okay film, however, separating the film's quality from its box office performance, it's clear to me that it didn't feel like a movie you had to see in theaters. Now, I'm no box office analyst, but if you ask me, it just didn't have many wow moments to make it stand out, in my opinion. People said there wasn't any advertising, when in reality, there probably wasn't much anything special to advertise. So really, the film critic in me was fine with what we got, but the moviegoer in me really wanted to see more. I actually looked at some early concept art, and was intrigued that we could have seen Elio exploring different galaxies around him, getting to know the aliens he meets, and facing off against what was supposed to be the major villain of the film. And you know what? Pixar has got to stop releasing all of their films in June. It's clear that month houses most of the major summer blockbusters, so a smaller film with no established fanbase like Elio never stood a chance against the barrage of sequels, remakes, and adaptations. And I'm going to admit, it's getting pretty expensive to visit the cinema, and moviegoers would want to make their trip worth it. So yes, the film is a bit formulaic in its plotting, but once again, I hardly think that's the reason why it bombed. I find it really baffling that people think that this is the worst movie Pixar has put out. I mean seriously, this movie is what got you so riled up? It has an 83% from critics on Rotten Tomatoes, and a 91% from audiences. Sure, it's not up there with Pixar's greatest hits, but I find it very absurd that people think it's actually trash. I can wholeheartedly say for myself that this film isn't the best, but it isn't the worst either. It's simply just your standard kiddie fare that feels more mature than most. And didn't I hear a few months back that you guys favored simplicity? So to all those who ended up not liking it, I am terribly sorry that this film is not gourmet perfection like Pixar's glory days. But I don't expect all of you to know what made Pixar so special. Additionally, I don't expect all of you to know what makes a good film either, because I know a lot of you end up favoring a lot of less than stellar and even derivative crap in theaters anyway. And yet you give Disney and Pixar all the slack because they're more well known. Hell, I have a hard time believing you even care about Pixar to begin with. After all, the old discussion was about make more original films, Hollywood, but then you decided to move the goalpost to this movie isn't good enough. Unless there's something else at play.
I'm going to say something crazy. Oh, embrace yourselves, it is a whirlpool. There is no high demand for original films. It is just a mass amount of coke spread by terminally online losers who are just tired of seeing sequels and remakes in theaters all the time. Sure, there are people who genuinely care, but for the most part, it is all just noise.
But I can see that most of you will want to challenge me in that sentiment, and therefore, you'll bring up a little film on Netflix that I could argue had a lot less promotion up to its release, but then instantly became a massive sleeper hit on the streamer, and is now their highest rated animated film and their highest viewed film of all time. It's about a trio of demon slayers who live a double life as a popular K-pop group in the modern day, to keep on the lookout for any demon spawns in their midst. The spawns, however, retaliate by disguising themselves as a rival group, and now the Slayers have to compete with them, and you get the picture. But let's think about the premise for a bit. A group of 3 girls fighting against the forces of evil while trying to live semi-normal lives. Oh sure, totally never been done before. You could argue it's a clever twist on a familiar setup, but of course that'll take a little extra brain muscle. And like I said, those of the terminally online ilk did not have the mental capacity to say they actually wanted quality films until now.
Now, granted, I have yet to see K-pop Demon Hunters, but I'm sure it has a well-rounded story and characters, high stakes, and heart-thumping soundtrack to make up for its familiarity. Or the people who are glazing are just attention deficit over anime expressions and hyperfluid action sequences. It's most likely the latter.
Speaking of which, notice how every time the so-called animationist cinema crowd gives massive praise towards an animated film, it's always a movie that just so happens to have hyper-quick anime-inspired action sequences. These people did it with Puss in Boots 2, they did it with the Super Mario Bros. Movie, and they're most likely doing it with this movie. I find it real funny that these fans don't give the same amount of praise to films like Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, The Wild Robot, Flow, Miyazaki's Return to Cinema, or the Spider-Verse films. Well, not until now that is. It sounds more like they're expressing favoritism towards a rival studio or animation style. But hey, so this is what Disney's been missing in their films as of late. It's not that their story and characters were lacking depth and originality, they just needed Elsa and Rapunzel punching and kicking each other in hyper-stylized fashion until one of them hits the wall. Do you want to know something else? This is probably the only movie that they will try to use to prove to people otherwise that there is high demand for original films. But if that's the case, why wasn't this film released in theaters? We are talking about films in theaters after all. Why would their newly proclaimed kings of animation just dump it onto Netflix when they knew they had a golden egg worthy of a theatrical release? One would suggest a lack of faith from the parent company, but that's another story. But need I say it again? We are talking about films in theaters after all, and we are talking about Disney producing more original films. And I hate to play devil's advocate, but Pixar had every right to call you bozos out on Instagram for not showing up to the theater when you said you wanted original films. But go ahead, play the victim. I'm not going to stop you. What I am going to do is name just a few original movies from the major studios that you may or may not have missed out on this year. Hard Eyes, Companion, Novocaine, Drop, Sinners, F1, Weapons. As you can see, out of the 7 good films I listed, only 3 of them managed to find some success. Unless the animation ass kissers will want to argue that those less successful films got no promotion either. You know what? Why are we still using success at the box office or on streaming to determine a film's worth? I've said this before. It's not representative of the film's quality, it just means it got a lot of eyeballs glued to the screen. Some of the best films in history started off as box office disappointments, and it wasn't until later that they got the recognition they deserve today. Therefore, I'm going to argue that the only reason these films found success is not because of a good original story or concept like the internet wants you to think, but because of the people behind it, who can guarantee moviegoers won't waste their precious dollars. F1 is pretty derivative, but Brad Pitt along with Michael B. Jordan are both recognizable actors that can easily drive box office sales, especially if they give off great performances. Also, directors Ryan Coogler, Joseph Kosinski, and Zach Kreger have proven themselves that they can deliver a cinematic experience that audiences won't forget, which is probably why you see the caption "from the director of" on movie posters. Story and characters could factor into success, however, I know what I mean when I say not everybody goes to the movies to become the next Spielberg or Tolkien, and there are definitely other factors to consider. Some may view it as an art form, others may want a stunt show spectacular. It is very much possible that K-pop Steam and Dusters is blowing up on streaming not because the story is original or because people resonate with the characters, but rather because it's a mishmash of two of the hottest genres in the media landscape, that being K-pop and anime slop. Like I said, it is all just noise. It probably also has a killer soundtrack, with many of its songs headlining the Billboard Top 10 charts 10 times in a row. And let's not forget the constant barrage of memes people are posting online about it. Meanwhile, all Elio got was drama. I forgot to mention that this film was supposed to release in March of last year, but was delayed, because Pixar wanted to retool the movie for wider appeal after test screenings revealed that nobody raised their hands when asked if they would see it in theaters. And the movie that made its way into theaters is apparently the worst one. It turns out, in the original cut, Elio was going to be queer, have a potential male love interest, and perform fashion shows on the beach, all based on the childhood of the film's original director, Adrian Molina.
Okay, I cannot continue just yet because I keep hearing animation fans in my head holler, "Release the Molina cut, you cowards! How could you strip the director of his vision? Pixar is anti-art!" Well, let me just ask you this. Did Molina's original vision have demons disguised as handsome Korean men seducing unsuspecting citizens with their music? Story-wise, Elio's queerness would have gotten in the way of his relationship with Glorden, if Glorden was part of the original cut to begin with. Also, people seem to forget that this type of content got multiple Disney films banned in 20 or more countries in 2022, hurting the box office even if it wasn't front and center. Heck, the story could have been just as minuscule even given the massive budget that people online kept lying about. Oh, and about those deleted scenes that released to the public a few months back. You could argue that they would have improved the story, but then again, those could have easily been filler that didn't contribute in any way. So I'm just going to stand by and say this film would have bombed anyway, even with the original story elements in place. Looks like all that extra labor in reworking the movie was for nothing. And someone from Pixar saying that their film is the worst version isn't helping the company in any way. They are just adding more fuel to the fire in the constant barrage of negative press, along with the claims of no promotion, the stupidity surrounding the art style, and people pretending to care about Pixar in the long run. So yes, it is very much possible that Elio was sabotaged, but not by who you think. Okay, let's recap. There is no high demand for original movies. The internet is just filled with liars, hypocrites, and people who just whine all day, but we already knew that. The only reason people do go see original movies, and movies in general, is not because of the stories themselves, but rather because of the spectacle, star power, and overall appeal of a blockbuster, none of which Elio had to offer. Couple that with the rising ticket prices, troubled production history, competition at the box office, and lack of positive word of mouth. And we all know the true reason of why Elio is the biggest financial failure in Pixar's film catalog. So, with all that said and done, is Pixar on the verge of death? Well, you have to be a real scumbag to actually think that.
The answer is no. Pixar will definitely survive for the remaining half of the decade. People complaining that Pixar is dying seem to have forgotten that their previous films before this one were quite profitable. Listen, I myself can't stand Pixar announcing more sequels in the future either, but I hate to admit it, they do sell for the most part. I like to believe that the greenlighting of sequels has less to do with nostalgia bait and more to do with surviving in the current climate.
But what does that mean for Pixar's original film slate?
It is clear that Elio was the product of an era that Pixar sadly has to leave behind, which is a shame because I did find some enjoyment in those projects. However, it showed us that the artist's vision isn't always the most profitable, no matter how good it might be. So if you are very desperate to see the old Pixar magic once more, here's what I believe should happen. Pixar needs to reassemble or reorganize their brain trust. Back then, Pixar's writers would collaborate together on ideas for improving their stories and characters. But that's all I can offer in terms of improvement. I don't expect all of Pixar's films to have crazy high concept world building. Also, I can't guarantee that all of them will be massive successes. As I stated before, the movie doesn't just have to be good, it has to have enough moments or story beats to wow the audience. The artist's vision isn't enough.
Now, before I conclude, some of you are wondering one more thing. That is, why did I go out of my way to defend a movie that I could honestly care less about? Even if the movie wasn't up to my standards, I care more about finding the truth, even if it's not what most people believe. And I don't have to be right about what I say. All I have to do is make a point. Sure, I can make some sarcastic remarks time after time, but I always make sure to remain consistent. Which I can't say much for other people who did not have the gut to stick by their word.
So here's one more message to the crowd. If you want to demand more original movies from Hollywood, actually put in effort to visit the cinema. Not just for the movie, but to preserve the theatrical experience, even if it's not always the best. And next time, just ask for good films, and be specific about what you want in terms of quality. Actually, I got a better idea. How about shut your pie holes? Quit complaining about sequels and remakes, and quit demanding original movies altogether if you don't truly believe what you say. And let's hope to God Almighty that you don't end up just as bad, if not worse, than the Snyderverse cult.
Am I glad to get that off my chest. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have another video game adaptation to tear apart. Thanks for watching, and remember, out of all the nastiest things said on the internet, my opinion matters most. Bye-bye!